Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Calvin. Another friend of the podcast who it's been a little bit since we've spoken to him, but he's been putting many miles on his truck, going back and forth between his home in Wood River Valley, Idaho, into Colorado. He's a conflict mitigation specialist for roughly 2 decades, and he just started his own LLC, Western Wildlife Conflict Mitigation. He is Kurt Holtzen. Kurt, great to see you again, my friend. How is everything going with you?
Yeah, it's nice to be here, gentlemen. I appreciate you guys having me on. Doing pretty well. I'm kind of glad the summer is winding down. It's been a lot of travel, met a lot of folks, and it's been really good. So happy to be on.
Yeah, I was thinking about you yesterday because we were driving down the road near our place, and hundreds of sheep coming out of the backcountry is one of the coolest things to see. I mean, how do they decide when to put them in and when to pull them out? Is it just a typical time frame, or is it of course, in generalities, is it conditional on weather or food availability, or how does that usually work for sheep farmers?
It's a little different everywhere, but specifically here in the part of Idaho that I'm most familiar with, it starts in the spring. As a lot of them start out on the desert country. It greens up, and then they kind of follow the green up into the higher elevations, into the backcountry, and then as fall approaches, then they kind of reverse and they come back down as the cooler temperatures and frost and the grasses are not as good. So generally in this country, it's May, and then this time of year, October, when they start to come back out.
Steven, did you see, was it somebody hurting them, or a couple of people hurting them, or was there a range rider there? What was
It's usually, this is like right near my house, like within a mile. I see them every year coming in and out, but there's usually about 3 to 4 guys, and then there's 2 to 3 dogs, and then there's another guy, and I'm just assuming, but he seems to follow them with a horse trailer almost. And I guess if certain sheep are not doing well after the trek out of the backcountry, they just load them up in the trailer. Otherwise, they just walk down the road and block just hundreds of sheep blocking the road. It's pretty amazing. This is the first year my son has gotten to see it. Now he's big enough to look out the window when they pass by. He was having a blast.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool. What's the typical, we probably asked you this years ago, Kurt, but like when they do that large trek, are I guess herdsmen, I don't know what the correct term is, so please tell me. Are they having range riders, like guardian dogs? What's like the typical thing to make sure that the sheep are doing okay?
Yeah, within a typical sheep band in the backcountry, is that okay?
Yeah. Like like what Steven's talking about. If you have any idea about
that. Typically there's at least one herder. Oftentimes there might be a second herder involved, and which is better. And then up to between 4 and 7 livestock guardian dogs. And then the herder probably has 3 or 4 herding dogs, border collie type dogs for moving sheep or cattle along. And then there's generally a camp tender that makes the rounds to different bands and brings them, their food and water and all the things they need to stay in the backcountry. So it's fairly involved process, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely seems like it's involved, but it seems like it's a good practice, at least, that you have the livestock guardian dogs and you have the riders and stuff like that. Wanted to touch, before we get into what's been going on the ground in Colorado and what you've been working on, talk about your LLC, which it seems like it's fairly new, Western Wildlife Conflict Mitigation. This obviously is your bread and butter. This is what you've been doing for a long time. Talk about what's on the website, what you're promoting, kind of the things that you're giving to people with your services and what's going on there.
Yeah, so this is something I've done for a decade with other organizations and also on my own. And this year, really, it's been about a year since I started the LLC, and I've donated all my time this first year in Colorado with the help of some NGOs covering the cost of building parts for conflict mitigation tools. And I make a living doing something else, a pretty good living doing something else. So this has always been kind of a secondary hobby for me. And so we're kind of testing the waters to see if we can make a go of it full time. Because I have come to the point where there are enough people that I'm helping that I can't really get it done very easily in a part time capacity. So I put the LLC together. So I don't really want to be on anybody's payroll because I feel like that limits my ability to do and say what I want to say and deal with folks in the manner that I do. There's always that extra pressure of pleasing other folks involved with giving you a paycheck. So I've tried to set myself up to be able to utilize a number of different funding sources rather than be on a single payroll. So this first year has just kind of been a test to see how that works or if it works and what we can do with it. So far, so good.
So just get into generally what you've been witnessing or dealing with and the tools that you're trying to help the folks in Colorado, because as you know, kind of a whirlwind year. The first pups or the first wolves were dropped in. I know you were on the ground, maybe not for the actual reintroduction, but you've been on the ground many times, I think, throughout this entire process. So just talk about what you've been dealing with, what you've been seeing, and some of the ways you're trying to help conflict mitigation as these first wolves have been dropped off.
So I've really been working in Colorado for, I think, 4 years, going on 5. Made some of the first contacts back very early, and have built relationships and have been working with producers mostly in northwestern Colorado, but almost everywhere that they've had wolf presence, I've been on the ground and worked with some folks in some capacity. Maybe not as much with some and more with others, but and generally, nobody really has a good understanding of what conflict mitigation in Colorado looks like because with wolves, because haven't done it before. And a lot of the things that work other places, I think, are a challenge in Colorado due to a number of factors. It's a higher elevation. A lot of the allotments are very thick. Oak brush is very thick. A lot of the light-based tools are challenged because it's based on line of sight, and a lot of times, the livestock is in an area that line of sight is somewhat limited. So this first summer, I spent a lot of time on the ground assessing allotments and conditions and talking to folks and trying to figure out what's going to work in Colorado and what that looks like as far as conflict mitigation.
What are some of the takeaways that you had from those conversations, and when you have notes, I'm sure you're taking notes diligently. What are you now taking back to your home base to figure out when you go back the tools that are actually going to work in these situations?
Right. A lot of it is terrain based, and then the standard operating practices of these outfits and the herders and how they move the sheep through the allotments, how they bed sheep in the allotments, what kind of terrain we're talking about in these allotments, and really just trying to, I mean, for sheep, those folks have been dealing with predators for eons. So, they already are doing a lot of the things that I would recommend they do before, way before wolves, to try to cut down on black bear depredation, coyotes, and cougars. So, I'm basically looking at what I have in my tool bag that I feel like is going to work in those situations. And really, you can't. I really don't feel like you can say that X, Y, or Z is going to be the silver bullet as far as conflict mitigation in Colorado based on how it works in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming. It's just it's a completely different environment. And I think it's just going to take a little bit of time to tweak that and decide what's going to work.
You said something interesting before that I want to touch on before we go down the road a little bit more. You stated that a lot of people don't understand what conflict mitigation means. So explain that to anybody who's listening who maybe hasn't heard your previous podcasts, or if there's an understanding of what people need to maybe hear from you as a specialist about what that actually means and what the tools are to be able to use to have successful conflict mitigation.
So I guess really conflict mitigation is a fairly complex. I mean, it's not rocket science, but there's a lot of different things that go into it. The type of livestock, the terrain, how folks are using that terrain, and it takes a fair amount of time to, you know, set up tools, take down tools, move tools. I think most folks don't have a good understanding of the time involved in conflict mitigation. And as you become more proficient with it, it's quicker and easier. And really, I've spent a lot of time to downsize things to what I feel is the least amount of conflict mitigation tools that will make a difference, and limit the amount of labor and time and involvement by herders. And so we've gone with a lot of on animal conflict mitigation tools that are pretty easy. And when you put them on, and the animals, carry the conflict mitigation tool, and you're not really involved at that point other than some maintenance. But I think people have this idea that a lot of these things are a silver bullet, and you just say it. Why don't you use conflict mitigation? Well, I don't think most folks have an understanding of what's involved with A, trying to find something that works, and then B, implementing that on a daily basis, plus all the other things that have to be accomplished during that day, along with now the extra conflict mitigation. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings about what it takes, or how it works.
Do you feel like you approach things with a very different strategy for livestock grazing on private versus public land or wild ranging livestock?
There are a lot of similarities in that. You would think that the bigger pastures would be a lot easier than the backcountry allotments, and sometimes that's the case. But there are some challenges, especially with cattle in large pastures, trying to use flattery, trying to maintain flattery. The amount of flattery that's required can be challenging. And on backcountry allotments, when you have cattle out, they're generally not supervised like sheep are. So that is a huge challenge. And I don't really think anybody has a good solution for that, other than maybe range riding, just being out there. But that can be a challenge also, with having the right personnel and covering as much ground. I mean, these are huge landscapes in Colorado, or almost any of the Western states, but huge, and even the pastures are huge. So you're talking about a lot of ground to cover, which is time consuming, and you got to be in the right place at the right time. So, it all has its challenges. But, it's not impossible, and it does work. I don't want to sound like I'm putting it down too much, but you just really need to understand that this is difficult work. It takes the right type of person to do this type of work, and to stay doing this type of work. Because it can be a slog at times when you're maintaining flattery, or checking on herders, or spending the night listening to sheep sleep, waiting for something to happen. I mean, I always get the impression that people feel like it's just, why don't you just use conflict mitigation? Just like, seems so easy.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, seeing cows, wild ranging cows, they hang out in sometimes in some pretty dark timber, and I see them definitely in a lot of deadfall, steep stuff. just benches that you'd kill yourself trying to get to. I mean, they hang out where elk hang out a lot, at least near where I live. I can't imagine. I don't even know how they find them at the end of the season, let alone how they maintain devices like this.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Is range cattle, spread out, and that's really what you want them to do. Um, you want them to not be in one spot, but that makes it a challenge to check on them and find any dead animals, or really try to remove any dead animals is super challenging. And that's really why I've concentrated on animal conflict mitigation tools, because for me, I feel like that really is going to be as close of an answer as I feel like you can get. Your range riding is good, but if you have the tool on the animal and the animal takes it with it, then you're just that much farther ahead that you're not as involved, and the animal has the conflict mitigation tool on its person, basically, I guess, which is the ear tags and other things, which we had working in Colorado this year with different degrees of success, um, as far as how they're built and how they stayed together or didn't stay together. So it's challenging.
Have you experienced over this, I guess, roughly 9-month period since wolves have sort of hit the ground? What's the perception on the ground that you've seen? Because you work with a lot of ag, you work with producers. Are folks and groups in this state open to all the conflict mitigation tools, what it entails, the upkeep and things of that sort? Is there a little bit of pushback? What have you experienced on the ground? Because you're the one who's been trying to help foster these relationships in some way, as we've always talked about with you, about being down the middle and making sure that everyone understands that it's going to take time for these processes to land and ultimately, hopefully, stick so that coexistence can, keep going in Colorado.
Yeah, right. So I'm a little bit of a different animal because my background is agriculture, and that's how I approach this. I'm
Right.
a fifth generation ag, um, uh, from a fifth generation ag family, and I understand agriculture and the people involved pretty well, and been involved in conflict mitigation for a long time. So I approach it from a pro agricultural uh, standpoint. And to be honest, everywhere I've been in Colorado, or really anywhere, I've had great reception. Folks are very, very accommodating, very, very gracious. Have treated me very well. I'm very interested in speaking about risk management and conflict mitigation. Interested in the tools. I put a lot of tools on the ground in Colorado this summer with sheep producers and with a few cattle producers. Everywhere I've been, I've had a great reception. And I think a lot of people say they're in the middle ground, but I don't think there's a lot of folks that really, really occupy that space the way it needs to be occupied and as as a middle road type of stance, not really having an opinion one way or the other, just offering risk management and conflict mitigation, and nothing else. I mean,
Yeah. What are some of the things that you've seen or heard, even? Because this is, it's better to hear experience wise that you've seen that as maybe tipped one way or the other, whether it's things aren't working fast enough. Is that more of what we're seeing, or the right steps aren't taken? There's obviously been things back and forth online about the way this introduction was handled in Colorado, the way it's been handled with the removal of Copper Creek, the pack there. What have you heard and seen that leads you to believe that the middle ground is not being taken?
so a lot of folks are disappointed that it seems to be tilted um, towards the pro wolf side, in a lot of ways, because from the very beginning, lethal control is supposed to be in the tool bag, and I can tell you that I don't feel like that was ever on the table in this beginning round, and I think that's really been a stumbling block. Folks feel like they did X, Y, and Z, and that didn't work, and so lethal control should have been considered as an option. And I don't think it ever was on the table. And I've been in a few meetings early on, and folks have told me that yeah, that's not an option. So, and I think I mean nobody wants to consider that, but there are situations in which that becomes the best alternative. I mean, I guess removing wolves from that environment is second place to that, but I mean that has its own problems also. I mean it's a very difficult situation that's come about from a very unusual situation with the way the wolves behaved and where they denned and where they rendezvoused, and the fact that they were super interested in livestock and not very um, dissuaded by conflict mitigation tools, or really human presence didn't really seem to bother them. So this, I think, the first thing you need to understand is this is a super unusual situation that occurred for whatever reason. I don't have any clue why things came about like they did and why the wolves behaved like they did, but it's very unusual.
So that would be one of those scenarios where you'd say to yourself, right, there's not a lot else we can do other than what we've done. And so lethally removing them is the last option. I mean, what are some circumstances where you would say that, where removing either individuals or removing an entire pack is really the only option?
Yeah, that's a tough call because, you know, I don't know if anybody besides CBW has all the intel that you would need to look at. But when wolves are depredating and they're not, you know, there's a lot been made that the producers didn't do enough. And you know, I met these guys back in the spring, right as it was starting, and there was a gentleman I shook his hand, I looked in his eyes, and he was just shot. He was just strung out. He had been up at night, you know, watching cows, trying to calve, trying to keep the wolves out of the calves. These wolves were coming down very close to their home, and in fact, one of the first calves were killed in a corral very close to where they were, and it was just, I mean, they were just at their wits' end, trying to figure out what to do, and you know, I don't know. At some point, when wolves aren't responding to that level of hazing, you really have to look at what is plan B. What are we? I mean, where do you go from there? What if you have a range rider with bang shells and they're shooting the bang shells at the wolf without a whole lot of effect? I mean that's super unusual to begin with, and I don't know. It's too complicated a problem to answer without having all the intel, which we never had, and probably will never know for sure. But you know, it's a difficult situation. But you know, if you look at, are you looking at this as a small problem or at the bigger picture of wolf reintroduction in Colorado and how tolerance is built and how wolves are going to do in the long term, the long game considerations of what do you do to foster tolerance, and with the folks that are going to be living with wolves every single day. These people are out, you know, daybreak and sunset, and they're going to see them and interact with them, and so I don't know. I don't know what. There's no good answer. I mean, everybody loses in that scenario, but
And they don't have that same problem with other predator species during calving season?
Not generally. I mean, coyotes probably occasionally will take a calf, but that's fairly unusual. Coyotes are not as bold, and size wise. Black bears will take a calf, and actually, black bear depredation on sheep is a pretty good thing in Colorado this summer. And a lot of folks had a lot of problems with black bears. So, which they already have a pretty good predator load. So, I think bringing wolves, and that's just one more predator to try to deal with. And actually, if I could solve their black bear depredation problem, I think that would be great. I mean, they have a much bigger black bear depredation problem with sheep specifically. So that's something I'm trying to look at over the winter to see if we can come up with some strategies to maybe help improve that.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I wonder. I mean, what do you think? Is it just an issue of familiarity where you're dropping off wolves in places they're completely unfamiliar with? Obviously, and elk are much harder to hunt than the average cattle that are just kind of hanging around. Is it? What's the likelihood it's just an issue of familiarity and kind of defaulting to what's easiest, particularly in an unfamiliar scenario?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think what you said is true. They're in an unusual situation. These places are at a higher elevation, 7,500, 8,000 feet. These folks are raising livestock at a higher elevation than you typically see in the winter or early spring in Idaho. Specifically, a lot of those elevations are lower, and the elk do come down and depredate on hay fields and that type of thing. But from the very beginning, they seem to be much bolder than you would expect. Especially in Idaho. I've done this for a decade, in and around sheep bands, with wolf presence, and I rarely see wolves. There have been a few times the herder has told me he saw wolves, so we went out and spent the night at the sheep camp. Middle of the night, the dogs go off like 3 o'clock in the morning, and they barked for 10 minutes. I was just getting up to go see what's going on, and they quit. And then the next morning, I went with a herder at daybreak to check the sheep, and there was 3 or 4 wolves up on the ridge, watching the sheep band, and from a quarter mile away. That's typically how I see wolves. And as soon as I saw them, they turned and left. And then I had a single shot shotgun, and I fired 4 or 5 rounds in the air to just let them know that they weren't welcome, and they left. And that sheep band was in that area for another 60 days, probably, and never had any other issues or any issues at all. So it's just not what I'm used to when people are seeing them in their yards and off the road, and the range riders telling me that they're seeing them at night, and they're getting within 30 yards, and the wolves are just laying down and watching them, and they're firing bang shells at them, and they really don't affect them. I mean, that's all very unusual behavior.
Yeah, I'm so curious why that is. It's just interesting.
Yeah, I would love to know that answer also, and I don't know if we ever will. The other thing that's unusual is that they denned in a neighborhood. Basically, it's a little subdivision that's off the highway. I don't know, a couple miles on a pretty heavily traveled road, and the den site is visible from probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 homes, and very close to where these ranch headquarters were. And the rendezvous site was exceptionally close to where the sheep were killed, probably 3/4 of a mile from where the hay stackyard was, and the corrals and where the sheep were staying. So it seems very unusual to me that they would select that type of area for denning and rendezvous. That's not typical. That's not typically what I run into in Idaho. So like I said, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to work with Colorado wolves or Oregon wolves that were relocated to Colorado. Um, so it's trying to put those pieces of the puzzle together, and that's really what the producers said to me was we expected to have wolves, but in the backcountry. We expected to have run into them in the summertime and maybe have issues in the summertime, but this was up close and personal. I mean, if you go there and look at the denning area and the rendezvous, it's a very compressed area, and it's very close to where people are living and where the cattle and sheep, and I mean it struck me as being very unusual.
That is, I mean, given that Yellowstone wolves, just as an example, see millions of people a year, and even their den sites, you have to, I mean, you got to have a high powered scope to see.
Yeah, it
That's
is.
pretty bizarre.
Eh, they acted fairly habituated to human presence, and I don't know why that would be because I don't think Oregon, they probably weren't seeing a lot of people. I really don't know what their history is, but I would love to know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, I know the next round or it might even be the next like 2 to 3 drops are all coming from BC from what I read. So they're coming from Canada. They made an agreement. So we just spoke with, we did just speak with Jeremy Sundaraj, and he was even talking about the difference between Yellowstone wolves and wolves in Montana and how they are able to survive in I don't want to say a crazier, but a more hunt-filled atmosphere where he's like, we were seeing wolves fairly on the regular. Again, he's researching and looking for them. So obviously there's always these discussions about where the wolves are coming from. Are they going to adapt? It's a brand new situation. How do we ebb and flow with that as the wolves that were picked, the wolves that were selected, released, and now the aftermath is here. So I feel as though the bigger question at this point for people on the ground, if you can put any information to this, Kurt, is what do you see as not necessarily the fallout, but what are we looking at now as we go the next year or so? Because we're talking about, obviously there's going to be another drop of wolves, and are there hesitations for people obviously now on the ground for this next batch? I saw that the Colorado livestock groups filed petitions to delay the reintroduction more. So that was something there. I don't know if you heard some of that rumbling before you left to go back to Idaho. What's the sense you're getting from this first go round and now as we look into the future? Are people willing to ebb and flow with that, or is there sort of a hard stop where people are just saying, no more?
I think that folks are disappointed that they feel like they came to the middle ground and there wasn't anybody else. There wasn't anybody there.
Right.
I mean, really, that's the sense I get, that, they were willing to use conflict mitigation and maybe they were slow about getting there, but I mean, this is an unusual situation, and, they've never dealt with wolves. Um, Most of these folks aren't big on government agencies. And working with government agencies. So there's a little bit of a rub there, and a little bit of a, not really wanting to do that. So, and, they feel like they're being pushed on, and, the natural reaction is to push back. I think some of that was part of the problem. As far as a pause goes, I don't feel like that's necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a lot of things that need to be looked at and readjusted, and this whole process feels like it was rushed. And really, I don't want to criticize anyone, but it feels like CBW is kind of a year or two behind the ball. I mean, they're just getting people hired. I know they were in Idaho and Oregon training this summer, this late summer. So it really feels like there was a big push and a rush to meet the deadline, and maybe some shortcuts were taken, or some things that fell through the cracks. Producer relations. I don't know. It's easy to criticize looking back, but it seems to me like it's just been rushed, and maybe take a pause over the winter and reassess what works, what doesn't work. Work on reaching out to producer groups and stockmans, and see if we can hammer out some better middle ground solutions, and working. It's just, I don't know what the answer is, but that's what it seems to me, and that's what I've heard. I've been all over North Park, Middle Park, Kremling, Northwest Colorado. I was at the Wool Growers Convention in July, so I've talked to a lot of folks, and nobody has said. I mean, nobody wants wolves, and nobody that I've talked to voted for wolves, but they kind of had this understanding that it was going to happen, and try to make the best of it, and have been willing to look at options to try to manage risk. But I mean, they've all accepted the fact that they're going to have wolves, but with the caveat that if they use the tools, the non-lethal tools, then, and that they still have an issue, lethal control is in the tool bag. And I think this summer has kind of made some people wonder if that's really the case, and you know, how long do they let it go? The problem just, it doesn't get any better. If things aren't working on the ground, what what is plan B? I mean, I think we need to hammer out what chronic depredation, what the definition is first, what qualifies as chronic depredation, and then B, what is the SOP to deal with that issue, and then follow it. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think CPW is there yet. They've worked on a little bit this summer with the ad hoc group, but those are really things I feel like should have been in place before wolves hit the ground. I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I think a lot of folks didn't expect this level of conflict this first summer. But I mean, it just seems rushed to me.
So when we look at this, though, because the retort from the wolf side is going to be, and this is obviously just so we have both sides, right? Is that we hear the arguments that you're coming at from the ground. So on the ground, from the producing, from the livestock side. So if there's a pause that happens, and people who see that, maybe the assumption is going to be, well, if it can get paused, it will get shut down altogether. And that they've raised money for the fund for livestock or sheep depredation. They have a license plate fundraiser that's raised a ton of money for these types of situations. These are things that people are going to have to deal with. I'm not saying this. I'm just saying this may be the reaction from the side of pro-wolf introduction and trying to have coexistence happen with all the native predators that were there prior to the move west. So if this goes on a pause, do you think the reception will be, like you said, measured to look at what's going on? Or do you feel as though this could start a larger valley between the two sides, in that one side has had issues? They said, let's put a pause on it. The pause gets granted. And then the other side says, well, wait a minute. Now we voted this in and now it's not going to happen. Are we running into this situation from you're on the ground, not me. Do you think this is going to create a larger caveat, a larger separation of the two sides?
From my perspective, I'm not sure you could get a larger separation at this point. It's a pretty wide gap right now. I mean, I think I totally understand that side of the argument, and it's a reasonable argument, but um, things have gone so poorly that I really feel like there's need to step back and try to assess why it went so poorly, and to try to find some middle ground solutions that are more balanced, and to define um, chronic depredation, what qualifies for chronic depredation, and what are the steps to stop chronic depredation if non-lethal tools are not working. I mean, I don't know. It's just, I understand what you're saying, but I really think the divide is really big in Colorado. And there's a lot of folks dealing in absolutes, that, you know, you can say you're interested in the middle ground, but middle ground means compromise and taking into account other people's ideologies, and all those things that, if you're so set in your own dogma and ideology that you're not willing to listen or give. I mean, it's all about giving space. And I don't know, that doesn't
Correct.
seem to be happening.
Yeah, I think that is an issue, just defining this middle ground, because part of it is sort of
Yeah.
difficult to arrive at. But it feels like if we're really about the middle ground, then we have to have wolves on the landscape in favor of biodiversity and native predators returning home. And if that's going to happen, then we may have to be okay with lethal management when it's considered to be the option, the only option, or the right option by professionals. And I guess at least after you've tried non-lethal management, the option to lethally protect whatever it is that you deem to be worthy of protection should be there. Because if that option isn't there, then it certainly can be viewed as a one-sided outcome, in that those who wanted wolves got what they asked for, and those that didn't have to live with the fact that they need to devote time and people to mitigate conflict, even when it hasn't worked. And in cases of excessive depredation, they can't lethally respond. I think supporting that as an option, even when it's hard, but when it's made clear that it's important to those that are living with wolves, is sort of partly what is required to be considered in the middle, despite I guess what has been said about destabilizing packs. Because if we're going to do this, we're going to have to compromise. I get what I want to a degree that we can live with, and you get what you want to a degree that we can live with, despite how either side feels about the other thing. And in the end, I like to believe that true compromise now will create a sustainable outcome that maybe we're all happy with later.
And I think both of those things can be true. From my understanding, from when everything was put into, when they filed everything and they were talking about the paperwork, what you're looking at with the lethal removal, my understanding, this is me, is that if you were to put that in there, the fear was people were not going to go through the conflict mitigation tools that Kurt so wonderfully is able to help people, is they were going to go straight to lethal. And so that's my understanding. And anybody who is listening to this, please, but I'm fairly certain, I don't know if that was the reasoning, but I can just sense we've done enough of these podcasts and talked with enough of these folks, I think, to understand that may have been the reasoning. Again, anybody who's listening, please feel free to contact me and tell me if I'm wrong. Kurt, if you're leading, Kurt Holtzen's in the meeting, or in the step back, right? what are some of the things that you would put at the top of your list to that make sure that gets addressed to move forward in a way like Stephen was just suggesting, that there is an actual middle ground and that both sides are heard, and that this thing will ultimately, we look 25 years from now, is a incredible success?
Yeah. So, wildlife management is pretty black and white. When you deal with when you're dealing with the wildlife only and not all the people and their feelings and their opinions, and you should look at the facts on the ground and let that dictate what the management is, and not the political side of things, and not the we want to appease this side or appease this side. Wildlife management is Wildlife management is pretty straightforward, when it comes to the wildlife side of it. It's the people that are super difficult to manage, um, and
Yeah, that's
make
true.
it tough. So we just need to stop polarizing this issue. I mean, folks just love to argue and fight and polarize this, and there are some folks that have no interest in wolves doing well. It's more about the verbal combat that they can engage in, that they enjoy. And I've run into a lot of folks on some of the Colorado forums that are just some of the nastiest people I've come across, and have no interest in solutions. They're steadfast in their absolute. They will not give, and there are no solutions in the middle ground that don't require uh, some compromise, and giving some space for other folks' beliefs, and uh, and it's just such a tough thing to try to stay in the middle ground with that level of polarization, and it extends to the management side of polarizing non-lethal and lethal control, to the point where folks don't want to consider it just because it's polarized so much. They don't want to even consider it. So we gotta somehow get past that point, and um, deal with this in a logical manner, a middle ground, looking for solutions that work for everybody. And I know those are all easy things to say, and difficult to try to implement with a group of people, but uh, none of the producers I have met have said they hate wolves, or they voted no, they don't want wolves. But under the right circumstances, I think they could live with wolves, if they felt like they had options. And I think they feel like they don't have any options right now. If they do non-lethal, they feel like the bar just keeps getting moved, because there's a process for CPW to approve a lethal control, which involves how much non-lethal is used. And some of the folks I talk to feel like that bar is continually moved, to where they don't feel like they can meet that criteria. um and I don't know if that I'm not sure we can get past that or not, but it's something that is palatable on the ground when you speak to these folks, that you're creating a situation in which they feel like non-lethal is being used to uh push off, or the back door of the 10J rule, in some manner, which is super disappointing, because I mean, in a perfect world, it's all conflict mitigation. Lethal, non-lethal is just conflict mitigation, and you select the right tool for the situation based on the facts on the ground. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, if you're doing it right. And uh, it's so difficult to get there in the climate that we have, the polarized, and folks that are just so set in what they want. Um, I don't know, it's difficult.
Well, I think what you said, though, carries a lot of weight in that you've spoken with producers and livestock owners and herders on the ground. And the concession on the ground is that they didn't vote for it. They don't necessarily like wolves, but there is a willingness to live with wolves and coexist with the correct tools in place. So I think that's a very strong point that needs to be made here, is that there are concessions being made, I think, on both sides, in that we have talked about this with you, I think, on both of our episodes prior to this, is that the extreme ends of both of these arguments are not where people should be living, and that they need to come in from those types of places to have discussions like this with folks who are on the ground, to be able to make a concerted effort so that everyone gets the things that they need to continue living their lives, to continue doing the research for wolves being back in Colorado for the first time in a very long time, and for folks to continue their livelihoods that live in the backcountry, that live in the western slope. And so those are things that should be able to be achieved if we get to this point of radical middle, of making concessions that are an understanding between both parties.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, John. And we just need to need to be able to find the middle ground. I don't think we've found it in Colorado yet. You know, it's a difficult place to operate from. Folks are just so set, so polarized about the issue that it doesn't leave a lot of room. The middle ground is a fairly narrow place, I feel like, especially in Colorado. So
if you were to give one piece of advice, if you haven't already, and if you've said it before, I would just say it again. What's the piece of advice that you would give both sets of groups of folks in this situation to start the conversation about moving this forward and having this, like I say, 25 years from now, this is a successful venture that all of Colorado can be excited about?
I think we just need to be more open, better communication, you know, need to trust some folks a little more. Trust some producers. Everybody I've met are really good people. I have not met anybody I dislike or thought that, wow, this person's really out there. They are really good people, and I have really enjoyed meeting them. And in fact, I'm going to a wedding this weekend in Colorado. I've made some really good friends on the ground, and we need to make this tolerable for as many folks as we can, on both sides, I suppose. But just based on my decade of working in the field, the folks you really need to have tolerance are the folks that are living with wolves. The folks that are out there every single day, they really are going to decide how well wolves do in Colorado. And the tolerance that we need to be building now. And we've had a rough start.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme. It's just everybody agrees that, when you go into someone's world and you are open and you are listening, people are in general really good people, and everyone can sort of relate to each other on a very deep level. And all of this sort of verbal conflict is happening in digital worlds, online. You know what I mean? Like Instagram is not a real place. I don't know if anybody knows that, but no one's behaving like they actually behave in real life on Instagram. So all of this fighting that's happening in the comments, this is just a placeholder for going and meeting people and having real conversations in person. And you're going to find that these folks that you think you disagree with, you don't disagree with as much as you think you do if you're looking at comment sections or arguing on the internet. This is just not where the best version of ourselves is coming out to speak. There's just no proxy really for meeting people in person and judging based on what you see right in front of you. There's no way to find common ground faster than to do that.
Yeah, I have dropped out of several Facebook forums just because, I mean, people are just so nasty and not interested in solutions. They just like the verbal combat. And we just need to get away from that and stop polarizing things to the point where there's no middle ground. I mean, you just can't, there's no give on either side. And solutions, you just can't find a solution in that scenario. So somebody's not going to give something.
Oh, totally.
It's just so disappointing that there are some NGOs and some folks that want to place blame solely on the producers that were put in a situation that is very unusual and not something they were really prepared to deal with, and they did the best they could with what they had to work with. And I just feel like that there's a lot of folks that are beating them up pretty good over this, and I really don't feel like they deserve it. I've been out there, I've talked to some of them, and the perception that they didn't do enough or that they weren't doing anything, and they didn't, it's not true. And I don't know, we just need to get past the blame game, and I really think take a step back, assess the situation, define some of the SOP, and then stick to it going forward.
And I think we forget too that the more we play the blame game, or the more we argue about this, or the more we turn it into a us versus them thing, the worse it gets for wildlife. The harder it is for conservation bodies to conserve, and the harder it is to implement meaningful strategy. And in the end, all that hurts mostly the animals.
Here's the really disappointing point to that, is that there are folks in that forum that are sitting back and not commenting. I know many producers who are in those groups watching, and
I agree.
That's how they're forming their opinion about the other side or the middle ground, or and that's super disappointing. I have had many messages from folks that are in those forums just watching this verbal combat, and about, hey, we like what you're saying, and we're interested in solutions, but they don't comment. They're watching this whole battlefield go on, and the polarization of the whole topic, and that's really disappointing to me that that's happening.
Yeah. And we're already in a biodiversity crisis as it is. And the more time, like you say, we all spend not having conversations like the one the three of us just had, instead of looking for the next zinger and signing off and saying, well, I won the day, it just doesn't do anything for anybody. And that's where people who are actually doing the work on the ground and trying to make legitimate change and find common ground, it makes it that much more difficult to deal with that, because just about everyone is logged in and on some platform. And so unfortunately, they will find common ground with the ones that agree with them, and it will just continue to divide. And hopefully we can try and sort of pierce our way through that, sort of part the sea a little bit, or do whatever you want to call it, and try and be like, hey, come join us down the middle aisle or whatever. Invite everybody to your weddings. Like that's the answer. Kurt got invited to a wedding.
Right.
It's like, come on.
Yeah, find yourself invited to a wedding. We just we got to get to know people in the real world, and this is a long play. This is not going to happen overnight. It has to happen with this kind of genuine interaction.
It's basic stuff. It's basic human decency. Kurt, I know you had mentioned to Stephen and I off camera before we started recording that you are engaging in some really exciting new ventures and ways to talk about conflict mitigation. I know we discussed a lot of that stuff today, but just go into working with folks like Jeff Reed of Cry Wolf Project. Funny enough, we're actually going to be interviewing him in the coming weeks, so that's going to be an exciting podcast for us. And you were saying that there's a Swiss company that is doing pheromone-based conflict mitigation. So please tell everybody who's listening to this, what first with Jeff Reed, what that means if we're talking about bioacoustics, and then talk about the Swiss company and what they mean by pheromone-based conflict mitigation, because that really sounds exciting and new and possibly a new way of doing things.
Yeah, so I'll start with the Cry Wolf project, and really it's something I've had in the back of my mind for probably 6 or 7 years, and it's an old concept. I think I saw it in a book, in a biology book or wildlife management book years ago, that creating a phantom pack, occupying a territory with synthesized wolves. And so I actually saw your episode with Taylor, and I decided, hey, well, that's exactly what I was trying to do. And these are the folks that know way more about it than I do. I can put it together technically on the ground, and they have everything else. They have the sounds and all the recordings. And so I reached out to Jeff and just spoke with him today for the first time, and using the sound generator, the Squawk Box that I put together, we're going to try to come up with a way to artificially create a wolf pack through howling, maybe wolf urine, maybe some kind of a captive scat to make territorial markers, to create a space that overlays either a grazing area or calving ground, and try to occupy that with this phantom wolf pack, and keep other wolves from coming in and encroaching on this, what is going to be a much larger, very strong sounding presence on the landscape. That's kind of the basics of the idea. And we just very early into fleshing out how that happens and what we do. It's pretty interesting to me, especially since Colorado has really been so different. And I think a lot of the light-based stuff is not working as well. It's or hasn't worked as well. And there's a lot of things you got to understand about how the light-based tools work. It's more of a psychological warfare, basically. You're trying to break their confidence. And in Colorado, a lot of the conflict is happening around human structures and roads and places that you would expect to see lights. So I'm not sure it has the impact that it does when I use it in the backcountry in a drainage that is dark, and there generally are never people there. It's not a barrier tool per se. It's psychological. It's breaking their confidence. It's not going to keep them away. But when they come and look at a situation, they're not as confident in maybe proceeding with going down and checking the sheep out closer. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that I think bioacoustic conflict mitigation will work better in some of those situations, especially on backcountry sheep allotments where there's oak brush and trees and timber. And where the light stuff, I think, is at a little bit of a disadvantage. So it's very important to be fluid and pivot when you're talking about conflict mitigation, and it's based on the facts in the field, what the terrain is, and so it's important to be flexible, and this is hopefully we can come up with something that will work just a little bit better in Colorado for Colorado wolves. So it was kind of the basis for it.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you were saying earlier in the podcast that the terrain is a problem, and it does make sense when you're looking at backcountry as opposed to where you're getting conflict, where lights are already present. there's already human sort of presence there. And so, right, it's a different situation that you want to try to do. Similar, I would imagine, to what you were mentioning about this pheromone conflict mitigation too. Is that similar to what you were talking about with urine and scat prior with Jeff Reed? Is there something different that this Swiss company is? Or did you approach them? Did they approach you? How did this partnership or this at least connection happen to discuss this pheromone-based conflict mitigation tool or tools that are being developed?
Yeah, that's kind of along the same lines. I can't say a whole lot because I signed an NDA, so I have to be a little bit careful.
Sure.
But the basic premise is it's kind of the same. The Phantom Pack, they synthesize wolf pheromone. What I was trying to do is to put it onto a commercially available ear tag or have them manufacture an ear tag that can go on cattle in a bigger environment. And it's basically the same idea as the bioacoustic. You're just trying to create the illusion or occupy space, and that wolves will respect as another pack or another territory. So that's the basic behind that.
Yeah. All that stuff sounds really exciting. And honestly, it's like you said, the more tools in the toolbox, the better off you're going to be.
And we've used in Colorado this summer. I did I don't know, almost 500 light tags that we put in the field. And when you scale up like that, you can find problems. And having the light stay attached to the tag has been a little bit of a problem. So we'll take a look at that this winter and see if we can maybe improve that. This is the light package that Wildlife Services came up with and adapted the sheep ear tags originally, and then I've tried to I put them on dog collars and also on cattle tags, the Ytex tag. But we'll try to address that. And then something that was a big hit is the cattle tag with a piece of glow in the dark. This is glow in the dark, commercial grade glow in the dark tape, and it really held in there. Way better than the lights. So we may try to develop that a little bit farther. And then of course the dog collars. And this is an example of one of the lights coming off. This is
yeah, you can see it got ripped right off there, basically.
Yeah. So, but this part glows in the dark. So, it's just more simple to design, the better. And we're just trying to, we upscaled a lot last summer. With the Foxlight kits, the ultralight Foxlight kits with carbon fiber posts and then the tags and so there are some things that didn't work as good as I'd hoped, but we'll take it back to the drawing board and make some improvements and put it back out there. I mean, I don't really want to sell this stuff. I'm not at all interested in selling this stuff, but you can't buy it anywhere, and I need it, so I build it. That's the basics behind it. And this summer, I had some great folks that paid for parts, and I donated my time, and they paid for some travel and hotel expenses, and so it worked out pretty good. We got a lot of tools in the field in Colorado over this last summer. So
before we sign off, Kurt, just tell everybody a little bit more about the your website there, Western Wildlife Conflict Mitigation, what they're going to find on there, and how, if they listen to this and they want to reach out and help you to make this a thing. You were talked about it very early on about want to make this a full-time thing because you are in demand and there's a lot of need for this. What can they do to help?
Yeah, you can log on to the website, westernwildlifeconflictmitigation.com. You can message me there. And then I post a lot of things on Instagram. That's a good place to follow what I have going on. And that's Kurt_Holtzen_ WWCM. And I post a lot of non-lethal tools and what I'm doing in that format.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. So we're going to have that information in the description. Kurt Holtzen, always great to have you on and to get your truthful candor and just your straight shooterness, I guess is the way I would put it there. That's a butchering of a word, but we really just appreciate the work you're doing on the ground and your striving to continue to make the radical middle a thing. So really appreciate you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and I always enjoy talking to you. And maybe we'll see you in a year and a half, or maybe sooner.
Hopefully sooner. We won't do that. Kurt, just hang tight while we sign off. House to everybody out there. Be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.